Hello, everyone. My name is Sharnice Peters, and I am a program analyst with the Energy Policy and Evaluation Branch of the Office of Community Services, Division of Energy Assistance. On behalf of OCS, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar providing a 90-minute training for the fiscal year 2020 Household Report long form. Today's webinar will be presented by Melissa Torgerson of Verb Associates and Darren Bausch from Apprise. Today's webinar is the second webinar on the Household Report. Today's webinar has three purposes. First, the webinar will provide a detailed review of the Household Report instructions and requirements. Second, it will review changes made to the report based on the award of the LIHEAP CARES Act funds. Finally, this webinar will provide you with key reminders to help you submit the report and to help you find and address any reporting issues. The audience for today's webinar is LIHEAP state and territory coordinators and support staff who are less familiar with the Household Report or want an in-depth review of the requirements and FY 2020 form changes. We appreciate your time and attention today, and we hope this is helpful as you prepare to complete your report. With that, I will now turn the presentation over to Melissa.
Thank you, Sharnice. Today's webinar is going to be 90 minutes long, and we will have opportunities for questions. All of the slides and resources that we reference in this webinar are available to you right now in the handout section of the GoToWebinar sidebar. And the webinar is being recorded and will be published on the ACF YouTube channel so that you can view again or share with other staff who may not have been able to attend today. As usual, we do have question breaks, and you're encouraged to ask questions as we go along as well by typing them into the GoToWebinar question box. The submitted questions will be reviewed and responded to at the end of the webinar or during the question breaks. If there isn't time, or if your question is very specific to your state or territory, we'll answer it via email. I'm not going to go over this, but many of you'll notice this is a 90-minute webinar, which means it's pretty dense. There's a lot of information, and many of you will come back to these slides for reference. And so this is really kind of an index of where key elements are within the slide deck. And so it's useful if you're going back to review the slides after this webinar. And now we're going to go into the basics of the Household Report.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. The Household Report has been submitted by grantees since the 1980s. It's one of the older LIHEAP reports that have been collected by the federal government. It allows OCS to report information to Congress as well as to the public about LIHEAP outcomes, which is something that's discussed in the LIHEAP statute. There's two main types of data that need to be reported on the Household Report. The first is to report information on households that received LIHEAP assistance during a fiscal year. And the second is information on households that applied for different types of LIHEAP assistance during that fiscal year. Historically, that data has been published in an annual report to Congress on the LIHEAP program. It's also published now and available to you and available to the public in the LIHEAP data warehouse. And it's used when there's requests from Congress or the administration about LIHEAP. This is an example of data from the Household Report that is available in the data warehouse. This is looking at heating assistance for all states nationally. And it shows you that about 2/3 of households that were assisted last year for fiscal year 2019 were below 100% of poverty. So you can actually get your Household Report data all the way back to 2000 in the data warehouse for your state, or if you want to look at other states or nationally. So the Household Report is one of the LIHEAP reports that states and territories submit. This is a graphic that's just meant to show you how all these reports relate together. The model plan lays out what a grantee is going to be doing in the coming fiscal year, what program components you'll operate, what factors you'll use in determining a household's benefit amount and what your minimum and maximum benefit levels will be. Then you have the grantee survey that looks back at the prior fiscal year and says, here's how we obligated the LIHEAP funds we had available. Here are the average benefits we provided to households. Here are the income cutoffs we used. Then on the bottom, you see your household report and your performance measures. Those reports help tell more about the outcomes of the assistance that a grantee provides. So the household report is really focused on households served and households served based on different characteristics, including poverty interval and vulnerability. While the performance measures that we'll be turning to in a later training focus on energy burden reduction, benefit targeting, and restoring or preventing the loss of energy service. Now we're going to talk about the new changes to the household report for fiscal year 2020. As you all know, in March, Congress passed and the President signed the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act. As part of that act, Congress appropriated about $900 million in supplemental funds for LIHEAP, and OCS awarded those LIHEAP CARES Act funds to grantees in May of this year. At that time, the Dear Colleague letter said that grantees would need to track and account for and report on the LIHEAP CARES Act funds. And to allow OCS to be able to do that and to be able to monitor the use of CARES Act funds, they have modified the household report for fiscal year 2020 and for next year's fiscal year 2021 report. So what are the changes that have been made to the household report? Essentially, for every item on the household report that we're going to go through in detail, there used to be one line for heating assistance, one line for cooling assistance, one line for weatherization. The report has been expanded from one line to 3 lines that you'll see if you look at it in OLDC or if you look at the instructions. The first line is where you report on all households regardless of the funding source. That's the same information that you would report in prior years. You report the total count of households that was assisted with heating assistance, for example. The second line is labeled as being for reserved for CARES Act supplemental LIHEAP funding. That's a new line where you would report the count of households that received assistance with some CARES dollars. Then finally, there's a third line, but the good news is that that third line is not applicable for FY20 reporting, and it's grayed out and locked. That's an extra line that they put on the report in case additional supplemental LIHEAP funds end up being issued by Congress and the administration. So here's a picture of what the report looks like now. You can see what I was describing with heating assistance. There's the original heating assistance in line 1. Now there's the CARES Act funding only heating assistance in line 2. The third line for heating that says reserved for other supplemental funding, that's blued out or grayed out. So in the end, what is being required for grantees is to report a total amount for each assistance and a CARES Act only amount for each assistance type. Now we're going to talk about some of the general reporting rules for the FY20 household report. So the first reporting rule is what you need to report in that top line. In that top line, you're asked to report the total number of households that received that assistance type. So that includes a household that was assisted with any federal LIHEAP funding source. So that includes your regular block grant funds for FY20. That includes any prior year funds you didn't expend until FY20 to give a household a benefit. And that also includes the LIHEAP CARES Act funds. So it's meant to be an overall comprehensive total count. The only households that would be excluded from that line are households that are assisted with non-federal funds. That includes state funds that you may use to supplement your LIHEAP federal funds, or any. It would also exclude any if your state obligated CARES funds separately to you for LIHEAP. Those CARES funds didn't come from HHS. Those would also be excluded. For the entire household report, you're only reporting on households that got at least $1 in assistance from federal LIHEAP funds. So the key point here is that the first line for each assistance type is you should be reporting in the same way that you would have reported in the past versions of the household report. Second reporting rule is looking at that second new line that's labeled as CARES Act funding only. For that line, you should be including households that received a benefit that was either entirely or partially funded with LIHEAP CARES Act funds. We're going to go through some different examples of how grantees may have used their CARES Act funds and how that would impact reporting. On this line, you wouldn't include any households that received $0 from your LIHEAP CARES Act funds. You're only including the portion from line 1 that got CARES Act funds to help provide them with that assistance type. And you can see that key point on the bottom of the slide there is that households who received assistance from LIHEAP CARES Act funds, they're counted in line 2, but they're also included in line 1. So line 1 total, line 2 CARES Act funding only subset.
So the reporting rule number 3 is also not new, and that is that we expect coordinators in states and territories to explain any unique program features or nuances in the notes section of the household report. And so if there's information that's out of the ordinary, or if it generates a warning in OLDC, or it requires clarification, we'd like you to add a notes in the notes section. This is especially true if you receive a warning message. If you have a chance to review your message and you find that it's not applicable, or that you've double checked it and it isn't, your information is indeed right, it allows Apprise to say, okay, they've checked that warning, they've seen it, and we know that this information is accurate, and then we don't need to follow up with you. These notes are used to give context and allow for an accurate understanding of your data, and we actually use that data when you put together the annual report to Congress in footnotes, so that if your legislator sees your data, they can understand why it is the way it is. And so this is an example. A grantee receives a warning message in OLDC alerting them that the number of households they reported for cooling assistance is substantially different from the prior year. The coordinator, you all entering the data, would check the information and confirm it's correct, because you might have expanded your cooling assistance program in FY 2020, which absolutely resulted in a large increase in households served. And so in the notes, you would just write, the change in the number of households served with cooling is correct. In FY 2020, we expanded our program, resulting in a larger number of households served. And this would allow Apprise or whoever is reviewing your report to look past the warning. Reporting rule number 4 has to do with unduplicated count of households in both the any type of assistance and bill payment assistance lines. And once again, we're going to walk through some of these with you, but both of these fields, the any type of assistance and the bill payment assistance, require an unduplicated count. And so for any type of assistance, you're going to report the count of households that received any LIHEAP benefits. So we've put an example here. Household A, the Smiths, get a heating benefit. Household B, the Bennetts, get both a heating benefit and a cooling benefit. And household C, the Jones, receive weatherization. when we get down to any type of assistance, we're going to count the number of households, so the number of rows, not the number of benefits each row got. So we're going to count the Joneses, the Bennetts, and the Smiths all once. So there are 3 households that received any type of assistance. Now, bill payment assistance is counted the same way, but we're only counting those households who received a benefit that was used to pay part of their bill. So in this case, household C, I can't remember what name I gave them, the Smiths maybe, received weatherization only. That's not a benefit that would directly impact their bill. It's not a bill payment benefit. And so when we get to bill payment assistance, we're only going to count households A and B who received heating and cooling assistance. So there are 2 households there.
Now we're going to do a poll question with you. These are really helpful for us to see if people are following us and we're doing a good job explaining or not. So this poll question is, if a household receives heating assistance with your LIHEAP CARES Act funds, where should it be counted and reported in the FY20 household report? So Jorge, if you could start that poll, and if you could all pick one of the answers. All right, we're going to wrap up the poll. Okay, so it looks like about 75% said in both lines, about 25% said in the second heating assistance line only. We're going to look at some examples, but the correct answer is in both lines. So it's a little maybe not intuitive right away, but there actually are no lines in the household report this year where you would report only people who got regular LIHEAP funds. There's just a total amount in the first line where you report people who got got assistance with your regular LIHEAP funds and with your CARES Act funds or with your CARES Act funds. Second line where you report the subset that received CARES Act only. So if someone received CARES Acts, they get reported in both that first line and that second line. And we're going to show you some examples of that. Now we're going to go into the first section, which is section 1, the number of assisted households. In this section, you have to report 4 different items. First is you have to report information for each type of LIHEAP assistance that you offer. Second, you have to report the overall count of assisted households that Melissa talked about, the any type of LIHEAP assistance information. Related to that, the third item is bill payment assistance. And then finally, if your state offers nominal payments for SNAP partnership, you would have to report that information as well. So this is an example of what you see in Section 1 in OLDC, and we're going to start by looking at heating assistance. So heating assistance, for that category, you should be reporting on households that received LIHEAP assistance to pay a share of a household's heating bills using funds that are allocated for your regular heating assistance. For some states, heating assistance can include households that receive expedited heating assistance, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And it may also include benefits related to equipment repair and replacement that's done on a non-emergency basis. But for the most part, heating assistance is your regular benefit that goes to a household to help pay a share of their heating bill expenses. There are a few states that do not have a separate crisis assistance component. Instead, they provide expedited heating assistance to households that are experiencing a crisis. So if this sounds new to you, it probably is not relevant for your state, but for states that don't have a separate crisis component or territories, you should report households that receive the expedited heating assistance under both heating assistance and crisis assistance, and include a note that that mentions that you provide expedited heating assistance. And you also want to confirm that your reporting is consistent with what's indicated in your model plan in field 4.8. As I mentioned, most grantees will have some kind of a heating equipment repair and replacement, but it's paid for through the crisis program and done on a non-emergency basis, or it may be done through the weatherization program and weatherization LIHEAP. However, there are some grantees that will report households that received equipment repair and replacement for furnaces and other heating equipment, and will report that under heating assistance if it was done on a non-emergency basis, and if they used funds designated for heating assistance. If that is the case in your jurisdiction, you can include a note that indicates the number of households that you report under heating assistance that received non-emergency repair and replacement using heating funds. So if this applies to you, we recommend you review this slide as you prepare to report. You're going to see this slide a few times through the webinar. This is just a great slide for reporting reminders. So when you're identifying the pool of households to report using, the first thing you want to remember is the time period. For the FY20 household report, you're only interested in households that were assisted during the federal fiscal year. The federal fiscal year for FY20 is October 1st, 2019 to September 30th, 2020. So if your state operates on a different fiscal year period, you should still report according to the federal fiscal year so that all states have the same time period for comparison. You may provide multiple benefits to households during a federal fiscal year. So the Smith family might receive 2 heating assistance benefits, for example. For the household report, for every line, you're always reporting on households rather than benefits. So if the Smith family got 2 heating assistance benefits, you'd still only count that household once when you are reporting for heating assistance. You want to count households that received any amount of LIHEAP dollars to provide them with heating assistance. Even if it's a small amount and you use other state funds to help supplement your LIHEAP funds, if a household received any amount of federal LIHEAP dollars, you want to report them. And then finally, on the bottom is information about where to report households for the new expanded household report form. Line 1 for heating assistance, you'll report all households that received heating assistance. Line 2 is where you report households that received heating assistance that was paid for, at least in part, by CARES Act funds. So that's the subset of households from line 1.
And now we're going to talk about lines 4 and 5, which look at cooling assistance. So in the cooling assistance section, we're going to report any household that received LIHEAP assistance to pay a share of households' cooling bills using funds allocated for regular cooling assistance. So this may be something paid toward cooling specifically, or in some states, this may be a benefit paid during a certain cooling time period or set of dates. For some states, cooling assistance might also include households that receive cooling equipment repair and replacement on a non-emergency basis. And we'll talk about that more in the next slide, I believe, or the slide after that. As Dan said, this is a useful slide, and I'm not going to go in as much detail as Dan did, but same as heating assistance, you're going to report households assisted during the federal fiscal year which is October 1 to September 30, even if your program year or your contract year runs on a different period. You're only going to report each household once, so if the Smiths got 2 cooling assistance benefits, you're still only going to count them once in the cooling assistance line. If a household was assisted with any LIHEAP dollars, it should be included in the household report. So many of you have asked us, well, it was only partially LIHEAP, and the rest of the benefit was paid for with a utility fund or state cares money. If even $1 of LIHEAP went to that household, it should be included in the household report. As Dan mentioned, all households receiving cooling assistance, whether it's CARES or your normal LIHEAP, annual funding, should be reported in line 4, and line 5 is a subset that includes only those who received CARES funds. And now we're going to talk about crisis assistance, and as you can see, there are several categories here, so we'll go into a little detail. So crisis assistance is a type of assistance that's provided in an expedited time frame after a request for assistance. You all set your own criteria for what crisis assistance is in your model plan. There are currently 5 types of assistance that can be reported in the report form: year-round crisis, winter crisis, summer crisis, emergency furnace repair and replacement, and other crisis assistance. So year-round typically includes crisis assistance provided throughout the year rather than seasonally, whereas winter and summer are seasonal. So these are crisis assistance provided under the same timeline as a state's heating assistance program or as a state's cooling assistance program. There's also go ahead.
Sorry, Melissa.
No.
Emergency furnace repair and replacements, another crisis assistance line that you'll see in the household report. These are programs where you're providing repair or replacement of home energy equipment using crisis assistance funds and done on an emergency basis. So this generally includes repairing furnaces, HVAC systems, or other heating systems within an expedited time frame. If you do report households for emergency repair and replacement, you have an emergency repair or replacement program, you should include a note in your household report that just describes what that program is, what kinds of assistance you are providing to these households, and an indication of how many of those households would be included in your regular crisis assistance categories. And again, the main categories are either year-round crisis, winter, or summer crisis assistance. So those categories are generally looking at a benefit to help with energy expenses, but emergency furnace repair and replacement is equipment repairs or replacements. There are 2 items in the household report under crisis assistance that are left blank where you can fill in information about other forms of crisis assistance you may provide separately from your main crisis assistance or your emergency equipment repair and replacement assistance. This is called other crisis assistance. This is not intended for reporting on your main crisis program where you're helping households in an emergency situation. This is intended for other programs you may have beyond your primary crisis assistance component. As I mentioned, there's 2 items where you can do this. On the new household report for FY20, the lines are between 7M and 7R in the OLDC form. If you do report information for other crisis assistance, we ask you to please include a note that just talks about the kind of assistance you're providing, what that program is, and how many of those households also may have received your regular crisis assistance. Here's that reporting reminder slide again for crisis assistance. Just as as another reminder, at the bottom of the slide, you'll see 2 lines for each type of crisis assistance. The first line is where you want to report all your households. So if you provide winter crisis assistance, for example, you want to report all households that received winter crisis assistance in that first line. If you also gave winter crisis assistance to households, if you gave some households winter crisis assistance using CARES Act funds, you'd report those households in line 1 in the total, and then you'd report those households in line 2 so that HHS can see how many households you served overall with winter crisis, and then how many of those households were served with CARES funds.
So now we're going to talk about weatherization. These are lines 8, 9, and 10 of the household report form. So in this section, you're going to report households that received low-cost residential weatherization and other energy-related home repairs with LIHEAP funds that have specifically been designated for weatherization assistance. And you're only going to report households that received equipment repair and replacement here if weatherization funds were used. As Dan mentioned, many people use crisis funds to do equipment repair and replacement, and those households should be reported in the crisis section. Equipment repair and replacement done with weatherization funds should be done in the weatherization section. So many of you use another agency or another department to administer your LIHEAP weatherization funding. And so therefore you may not directly capture information about weatherization assistance in your primary LIHEAP IT system. For those of you who are in this situation, you do need to obtain household level data from your subgrantees or your partners or those other agencies who record this information. Because in order to identify which households received both weatherization and those unduplicated counts of any type of LIHEAP assistance, you need to have unique identifiers for each household so that you can match those households, weatherization households, with your LIHEAP energy assistance households. There's a template online, I believe, that you can give to your weatherization partners that says, here's the information we need from you each year at this time. And Apprise has helped a lot of different states and territories with this process. So if you're having issues getting data from your partners or getting the right data from your partners or merging it once you get it, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask for assistance. As with the other program components, households for receiving weatherization assistance should be reported for the period of the federal fiscal year, which is October 1st through September 30th, regardless of when the weatherization program in your state actually runs. If for some reason there's a household or households in your state that received weatherization more than once during the year, you're still only going to count them once in the weatherization section. And weatherization is one of those benefits that is often combined with other resources, DOE or utility conservation funds. And so if a household was assisted with any LIHEAP, if even $1 of LIHEAP was used in their weatherization kind of portfolio or package, it should be reported in the weatherization portion of the household report. Line 8 is going to be where you report all households that receive weatherization assistance using any federal LIHEAP funds. This includes CARES Act funds. And line 9 will include only those households that received weatherization assistance using CARES Act fund.
Okay, so we've talked about the different assistance types that you may have: heating assistance, cooling assistance, weatherization, crisis. And for each of those, we've been looking at each one separately. Now we're going to look at the any type of assistance fields, which are looking at counting households across all of those categories. So for any type of LIHEAP assistance, we're looking at counting an unduplicated number of households that received LIHEAP assistance during fiscal year 2020. That includes all of the types of assistance that we just discussed with you. To do this, you need to be able to combine information across each of those assistance categories, and you need to identify each household and count each household only once, removing any duplicate records. So for example, if the Kim family received crisis assistance and heating assistance, you want to only count them once when you're reporting any type of LIHEAP assistance. You don't want to report the Kims twice. This is a really important information because the any type of LIHEAP assistance line tells you how many households you served during a fiscal year. It allows HHS to know that and to tell Congress and to tell the public. So there are a couple rules to help you if you're not sure if you get a report from your IT staff and you're not sure if the any type of LIHEAP assistance count is correct. Here's 2 rules of thumb on the bottom of this slide. The count for any type of LIHEAP assistance should be less than the sum if you added up each of your assistance types. That'll be true if you allow households to receive more than one type of assistance. So the example I just gave with the Kim family, your total any type of LIHEAP assistance count should be less than the sum of adding heating plus your crisis numbers. The second rule of thumb is if your state or territory only allows households to receive one type of assistance per year, in that case, your any type of LIHEAP assistance count will be equal to the sum of households that were reported for each assistance type. Very closely related to this are lines 14 to 16, which are bill payment assistance. So as Melissa explained, bill payment assistance is focusing in on the households that you served by giving them a LIHEAP benefit to pay a share of their energy bills or their utility deposits. On the left, you see what this should include. This should include households that receive heating, cooling, crisis assistance benefits that help pay a share of their energy bills or utility deposits. It would also include households that receive heat and rent payments. The right side of this slide shows the households that wouldn't be included in bill payment assistance. That would be any households that received LIHEAP weatherization assistance, but didn't get regular heating or regular cooling or regular crisis, or households that had their energy equipment fixed or replaced through your equipment repair and replacement program, but who did not receive any other types of regular LIHEAP assistance. You also, if you're one of the about 10 states that provide nominal benefits as part of a SNAP partnership, you also would not want to include them in this count. So this slide's just a helpful reference point for what should be included for bill payment assistance. So some of the general reporting guidelines, just as with any type of LIHEAP assistance, for bill payment assistance, you're looking at an unduplicated count of households. And you'll need to be able to identify households across your assistance types using a unique ID or a household identifier. Now, if you provide weatherization or equipment repair and replacement through LIHEAP, you want your count for bill payment assistance should be less than your count for any type of LIHEAP assistance. If you do not provide weatherization with LIHEAP funds, and you do not have any equipment repair and replacement that you provide with LIHEAP funds, then your bill payment assistance count will be equal to your any type of LIHEAP assistance count. So similar to the earlier slide, that's a way you can check to verify the accuracy of your counts. Okay, now we're going to look at nominal payments. These are the last lines in the last category. For nominal payments, this is referring to a household that receives a LIHEAP benefit as part of a partnership with SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. As I mentioned, there's about 10 states that participate in this. As part of it, a household receives a benefit of at least $20.01. If you are a state that has this, it's commonly referred to as Heater Eat or Cooler Eat. If you do have this, you should count and report all households that receive that nominal LIHEAP benefit. And you should include a note in your report that describes the nominal benefit that you provided. You do not want to include these households in the any type of assistance line because this is not a conventional form of LIHEAP assistance. And you should be indicating in your model plan if you're providing nominal benefits as part of a SNAP partnership, and that's field 1.7a. Now we're going to look at some examples for how to report in Section 1 with regards to the new reporting requirements for CARES. So this is what I mentioned we were going to do earlier. So this is, if you were on our first webinar in November, we went through examples like this. If you were not, this is a part that I think will be very helpful for you or for your staff as you're preparing your FY20 household report. We're going to look at examples of how grantees may be using their CARES Act funds and how that would impact their reporting. So scenario number 1 is Grantee X. Grantee X provides supplemental benefits using their LIHEAP CARES Act funds. If you read the bullets on the left, during FY20, Grantee X provided 5,000 households with heating assistance and 2,000 households with year-round crisis assistance using their regular LIHEAP funds. When the LIHEAP CARES funds were issued, they decided to use those funds to provide all the households that they gave heating assistance with an extra heating assistance benefit or a supplemental CARES heating assistance benefit. So when we look on the right at an image of the household report form, let's see how they would report this. So we know from the information on the slide that they used their CARES Act funds to give a supplemental benefit to all 5,000 households that got their regular heating assistance. So that means in line 2, where it says Heating CARES Act funding only, you'd put 5,000 because 5,000 households got heating assistance with CARES Act dollars. Now, since they use those CARES funds to give extra benefits to the same households that got regular heating assistance, that means that they only provided heating assistance to a total of 5,000 households. So in line 1, you have 5,000 because 5,000 got heating assistance. And in line 2, we'd put 5,000 because those same 5,000 got a benefit partly paid by CARES Act funds. What about crisis assistance? Well, Grantee X did not use any of their CARES funds to provide crisis assistance. So in line 7B, we're going to put 0 for year-round CARES Act funding only because they didn't use their CARES Act funds for crisis. Now, they did use some of their regular block grant funds to provide year-round crisis assistance to serve 2,000 households. So in line 7A, we would put 2,000. Now, if you look at the bottom of the slide in that last bullet, we're told a total of 6,000 households received any type of assistance during FY 2020. So that means in line 11, we put 6,000. Now, how many of these 6,000 households received a benefit that was paid for in part by the CARES Act LIHEAP funds? Well, we know that they used that to provide 5,000 households with a supplemental benefit. So we're going to put 5,000 in line 12. So in this example, 5,000 is reported 3 different places. The 5,000 that got heating assistance, the same 5,000 that got the supplemental benefit paid for by CARES, and at the bottom in line 12, the total that received a benefit that was paid by CARES. Now let's look at a second scenario. This is grantee Y, and grantee Y decided to use their CARES Act funds in a different way. Instead of providing a supplemental benefit, they decided they were going to provide benefits to more households, to additional households. So grantee Y initially provided 5,000 households with heating assistance and 2,000 with year-round assistance, crisis assistance, using their regular block grant funds. When the LIHEAP CARES funds were issued, they decided to use those funds to provide additional households with heating assistance, and they provided it to 3,000 households. Okay, so they used their CARES Act funds to give 3,000 new households heating assistance. So that means in line 2, we would put 3,000. Now we also know with their regular LIHEAP funds, their block grant funds, they served 5,000 households and gave those 5,000 households heating assistance. So that means 5,000 got heating assistance with regular funds, plus 3,000 other households got heating assistance with CARES Act funds. So 5,000 plus 3,000 equals 8,000 that got heating assistance, and that's what we'll put in line 1. Now, when we go down and look at crisis assistance, they didn't use any of their CARES Act funds to provide crisis assistance. So we're going to put 0 in line 7B. They did use some of their regular LIHEAP funds to provide year-round crisis assistance, and they served 2,000 households. So in line 7A, we'd put 2,000. When we go all the way to the bottom for any type of LIHEAP assistance, I told you in the bottom bullet that they served 9,000 households. So we'll put that in line 11. Now, how many of those 9,000 got CARES Act, got assistance from the CARES Act funds? Well, we know that they served 3,000 new households using those funds. So in line 12, we would put 3,000. So 3,000 in this case is reported in 2 spots. In line 2 for heating benefits provided with CARES Act funds, and in line 12 for any type of LIHEAP assistance with CARES Act funds. Okay, we have one more scenario here. That's grantee Z. And grantee Z decided they were going to use their CARES Act funds to create a new crisis assistance component. If you look at the first bullet, they provided 5,000 households with heating assistance and 2,000 with year-round crisis assistance using their regular LIHEAP funds. When the CARES funds were issued, as I mentioned, they created a new crisis assistance component that households could apply for to get assistance related to coronavirus impacts. They served 3,000 households with that assistance. So they have a new crisis program they created. So that means in one of the blank lines under crisis assistance, we can put in that new crisis component. So we're going to do that in that blank line M. Now that's where we're going to put the COVID crisis program. Now they used their CARES Act, all of their CARES funds for that program, and they served 3,000 households. So we're going to put 3,000 in line 7N, and then 3,000 in line 7M, because the total served were 3,000, and all 3,000 were served with CARES Act funds. Now they didn't use any CARES funds for heating, so we're going to put 0 in line 2. And they didn't use any for year-round crisis, their regular year-round crisis assistance. So we're going to put 0 in line 7B. They did use they did serve 5,000 households with heating assistance. So we're going to put 5,000 in line 1. And they served 2,000 households with year-round crisis assistance. So we're going to put 2,000 in line 7A. In line 11, they served a total of 7,500 households. That's indicated in the bottom bullet, so we're going to put that in line 11. How many got CARES Act funding only would be 3,000, the 3,000 that got the COVID crisis program. So we're going to put 3,000 in line 12. So these are just 3 different scenarios depending on how grantees may have used their CARES funds. There are variations of this, but I encourage you, if you have any questions or you're struggling with this, to reach out to us. But these are 3 examples we wanted to provide to you. Now we're going to pause and take a breather and answer some questions. If you have questions, type them in the question box, but I'll turn it to Jorge to see if there are any questions that have come in.
Hello, everyone. This is Jorge Ataprais. Dan, we have 2 questions that have come in so far. The first one is, do we need to write in 0 if we have no CARES Act funds spent this year?
That's a good question. So as you saw when we were going through it, there's CARES lines added to the form for each assistance type. If you haven't used any of your CARES funds, if you didn't use any during FY20, or if you didn't use any for a specific assistance type, you don't need to enter 0 or enter anything in those lines. You can just leave them blank.
Okay, there's another question. For other crises, does it need to be equipment related?
That's a great question. So yeah, under crisis assistance, there's many different fields, as we mentioned. The main crisis components that states have are year-round crisis, winter, or summer. So that should be where the majority of your crisis assistance households get reported under one of those categories. Other crisis usually is equipment related in some way, but there are also states that have special crisis assistance components for populations, maybe targeting specific vulnerable populations, where they give them a benefit that helps pay with energy expenses. And they would go under other crisis, but it should not be the majority of your households that receive crisis assistance. And if you have any questions, reach out, but that's something that we can always look at and help you with.
We got another question that came in. Can you explain again the difference between crisis and expedited? Expedited cases are including in the heating, but not crisis. So, what's up with that?
Well, Melissa, do you want to talk about expedited, and then I'll talk about the reporting aspect?
Sure. So in some states, a household can walk in and get a regular benefit, and then they can come in either at the same time or later in the year and receive a crisis benefit if they meet the state's crisis criteria. In some states, each household gets one type of assistance per year, and so if they're in a crisis situation, their one payment becomes a crisis payment, and it's simply expedited, meaning it just gets sent out faster than a normal payment would have, or the application gets processed faster. So there are a few states that only give each household one benefit per year.
Yeah, and for reporting on it, those states don't have a separate crisis assistance component, but they're providing crisis assistance and by expediting their normal payment. So to make it clear that they do provide emergency assistance for the household report, you would want to report those households under the relevant crisis assistance category, in addition to under the heating assistance category. Now, if your state provides expedited heating and something we've said sounds new or different, I'd recommend you reach out to us about it just to talk about it to make sure that we're understanding correctly.
And they should include a note too, right, Dan? So if they are including those households in both the heating and the crisis sections, they should just put a note about that.
Yep.
Okay, we have a few more questions that came in, but in order to make sure that we can get through the whole presentation in the allotted time, we're going to come back to them in our second question break at the end of the presentation. So we received your questions, but we're going to address them a little bit later or over email when they're specific to you.
Now we're going to look at section 2 of the report, and we've looked at the different types of assistance. Now we're going to look at how the household report asks you to report other information for each of those types of assistance. And section 2 is looking at reporting households by poverty interval.
So for this section, section 2, you're going to report the count of assisted households by poverty interval for each type of assistance: heating, cooling, crisis, and weatherization. The sum of the households reported by poverty interval in section 2 should equal the total households reported for each type of assistance in section 1. And for those of you who are visual, we'll show you an example on the next slide. Grantees should confirm that reporting is consistent with the income threshold defined in their state plans. So you all will want to make sure that if you said you were going to use the FY 2019 poverty level as your threshold, that you'll want to make sure that that's what you're using as your kind of baseline throughout all of your reporting. This is an example here. In line 1, you see that there are 13 households. In section 1, we saw there are 13 households served with heating assistance. And so when we get down to section 2 and reporting poverty intervals, we'd expect 13 households to be spread out amongst these 5 categories. And so that's a really quick check that you can do to make sure that the sum of everyone in section 2, line 1 under heating matches the heating number that you've put up in section 1. So when you decided what your eligibility requirements were for FY 2020, you had some options. You could use the FY 2019 poverty guidelines. You could use the 2020 state median income. If a program component began after the start of the calendar year, for example, cooling, you could switch to the 2020 poverty guidelines for that particular component. And you can also switch to the FY 2020 poverty guidelines when those guidelines came into effect mid-year. And so on the next slide, we're going to talk about what you actually do for reporting poverty intervals. In section 2, grantees should be reporting income standards used at the beginning of the fiscal year, which would have been the 2019 HHS poverty guidelines. And we put a link to where those are. If you changed your income guidelines that you're using mid-year, for example, you use 2020 poverty guidelines for your cooling program, this means you might actually have served some households over the original income threshold indicated in your model plan. And we understand that. And so what we would want to see if you did switch your guidelines mid-year is for you to add a note explaining this in your household report.
So how do you identify a household's poverty interval? It's a 4-step process, and this slide describes that process. First is for each household that you're providing assistance to, you need to collect their gross income amount and store that in your data system, your database, or other system. And you need to know the number of members that are in that household. Using that information, you can then estimate the household's poverty percentage. So for number 2, if the income amount you collect represents less than 1 year, you're first going to need to convert that to be an annual amount. So for example, if on your application you ask someone to provide income information for the last quarter, you're going to need to multiply that by 4 to get their annual income amount. Once you have annual income and you have the number of household members, you can divide the household's annual income by the dollar amount that is equal to 100% of the 2019 poverty guidelines for that household size. So there's different values for each household size. As Melissa mentioned, we have the link in the slides. You can also look under the information memorandum page on the LIHEAP-ACF website. Finally, once you've done the division, you would multiply the result by 100 and round to the nearest whole number percent, and that gives you their percent of poverty according to the 2019 HHS poverty guidelines, and you can identify which interval they would fall into. In general, you should have income information for all the households that you have assisted. There are rare cases where income information may be missing, and if that is the case, in Section 2 there isn't a line for missing income or a column, so we would ask you to place them into the highest poverty interval, which is 150% or more, and to please include a note that indicates the number that we're missing income information, so that we're aware of that. The note should just explain that they're missing income information, what type of assistance, and where you included them. One other point I just wanted to make about the poverty intervals is, as Melissa mentioned, you may have decided to use the later poverty interval standards. For example, if you had a cooling assistance program that started later. But for the purposes of reporting, you're asked to calculate each household's poverty amount according to the 2019 guidelines that were in effect at the beginning of FY20, so that all states are using the same standard, and OCS can have a picture of how many households were served at each interval using that consistent standard. Okay, now we're going to look at Section 3, where you're going to look at the breakdown of assisted households by vulnerable population. This is a picture of what Section 3 looks like. Like Section 1, it has all the same, has all the rows for the assistance types and the total amount versus the CARES only breakdown. Then there are 4 columns, and we're going to talk about each of those. The LIHEAP statute specifies 3 different vulnerability groups for the LIHEAP program. The first is households with an elderly member, which is a person 60 years or older. Second is households with a young child, which is defined as a person age 5 years or under. And the third is households with a disabled member. The LIHEAP statute doesn't specify what qualifies or is designated as a disabled member. So states can decide who would count as a disabled member based on their own definitions. Some common examples include members having a permanent disability or receiving disability insurance. So for your state, you may have other vulnerability indicators that are important for you in your program targeting, but these are the 3 that are a focus of the household report. So there are 4 pieces of information you're going to need to report for each of the types of assistance you provide and for any type of LIHEAP assistance. You're going to need to give the count of households that has an elderly member. Then you're going to need the count that has a young child. Then the count that has a disabled member. And then number 4 is the one I want to draw your attention to, which is you'll need to report the count of households with one or more of those vulnerability types. Now, in general, the households you report in Section 3 are going to be a subset of those you report in Section 1, right? So if you provided heating assistance to 5,000 households, there'll only be a portion of those households who have each of these vulnerability types or one or more of these vulnerability types. There'll be some households that may not have any elderly members, young children, or disabled members. So the Section 3 counts would be lower than Section 1. That may not be true if you have a specialized crisis program that targets vulnerable households, for example. Then your counts may match or may be close. So there's 4 steps that you would take to identify households with vulnerable members. The first is you need to collect information on your application or through your intake process where you ask households and you record information on household members and their characteristics. Second, you need to have that data stored in a data management system. And if you have a program partner that operates one of your LIHEAP program components, such as your weatherization department administering your LIHEAP weatherization, they're going to need to collect this information and store it. Step 3 is you'd need to create indicator fields for each of those vulnerabilities to indicate whether the household has or does not have that vulnerability. So, for example, you would have 3 yes/no fields: an elderly yes/no, a young child yes/no, and a disabled member yes/no, or 0/1 fields. So you have those 3 pieces of information for each household. And then the 4th step is you need to create an indicator for any vulnerability that marks whether a household has one or more of those vulnerable member types. So in column D, that's where you're going to use number 4 on the previous slide. Column D is elderly, disabled, or young child. And there you are reporting the count with at least one vulnerable member. We highlighted this middle bullet here because this is an important point. We sometimes will see that the reports will add elderly plus disabled plus young child. But that's not the correct way to report this because you may have a household who has grandparents in it and has young children in it. So those households, if you added them, you would be double counting. So for this field, you need households to be counted once only, an unduplicated count. If you need assistance with doing this, if you're facing challenges with your IT system, please reach out to us because we can work to help you so that you're able to report this field. Here's an example to help walk us through this. We have 4 households listed on the bottom in the bottom bullets. One household has an elderly member and a disabled member. One household has a disabled member and a young child. The 3rd household has an elderly member only. And the 4th household has a disabled member only. All 4 households got heating assistance, so we're focusing on line 1 for this example. So household 1, the first household, has an elderly member, and the 3rd household in the 3rd bullet has an elderly member. So the total households with elderly members is 2. When we move over to column B, disabled, there are 3 households that have a disabled member. The first household, the 2nd household, and the 4th household. Only 1 household has a child, age 5 or younger, so we're only putting 1 there, that 2nd household. For column D, since all 4 of these households have 1 or more vulnerability, the count we're reporting is 4. So you can see how you can't add across the columns because if you did, you'd get 6. But we're only looking at households, so the correct number to put there would be 4. We did want to note that there is a section at the very end of the household report that's optional. It's section 6, and it allows you to report additional information to break down households with a young child. It's not required, it's an optional section. There are 2 items that it asks you to report, and that may be useful for you in managing your program and looking at how you're targeting young child households. The first is you'd report households with at least one child who is 2 years or younger. And the second is reporting the count of households with a child aged 3 to 5. So it's a breakdown of the young child category we talked about earlier into these more narrow categories. Now we're going to move on to looking at the sections of the household report that ask you to report information about applicants. So section 4 is the number of applicant households.
So this can be a little tricky, especially for some new folks. The definition of applicant households is left to each grantee. The LIHEAP statute does not define the term. And so you should be reporting the number of households that apply for assistance, whether they get assistance or not, according to your own definitions. And so examples could be households that submit an application for assistance during the fiscal year, once again, whether they got assistance or not. Households that visit an agency to apply. Some people count that as an applicant household. Some people count people in their system who applied but maybe were denied or voided, for example, later in the year. So there are a number of definitions, and you need to look to your state to decide what that definition of applicant is. When we talk about CARES and applicants, if a grantee expended any LIHEAP CARES funds to provide households with benefits during FY 2020 for any type of assistance, you need to count and report the number of LIHEAP CARES applicant households, once again, based on your definition of applicant. So there are different approaches. If a grantee has a separate application form or process for a household to apply to receive CARES funded benefit, you can report the number of households that use that particular form or process. If you didn't have a distinct application form or process to apply to receive CARES, you can either report the total number of households that applied for the CARES type of assistance, which would repeat the information reported in the first line. So for example, if you or we're just tacking on additional money to a heating assistance benefit using CARES funds, then you might have the same number of applicant households for both heating and CARES heating. You can also report the number of households that applied for that type of assistance after you began issuing CARES funded benefits. How should the number of applicant households for each type of assistance compare to the number of assisted households for each type of assistance? So this is one of those checks that Dan has been talking about as you're going through to make sure that you're thinking about this correctly. In general, the number of applicant households reported for each type of assistance should be greater than or equal to the number of assisted households reported for each type of assistance. So once again, if I reported that I helped 10 families with heating assistance, we should see that at least 10 families applied for heating assistance in the first place. In many cases, your states will report more numbers that applied that may have been denied or over income or for whatever reason. If for some reason the number of people who applied for assistance is less than the people that were assisted, make sure that you have double checked that number and that you add a note explaining why that is the case.
Okay. We are starting to near the end, and we will have time for more questions. So if any have come to your mind, please submit them so Jorge can look at them and can get ready. We're going to look now at section 5. That's the number of applicant households by poverty interval. Here's what Section 5 looks like, and you can see it is very similar to the earlier section on the count of assisted households by poverty level, but there is one more additional column all the way at the end, column F, income data unavailable. So we're going to talk about that. So just as earlier with assisted households, for applicant households, you report the total number for each type of assistance. But then in this section, you're asked to break it down by poverty interval using the income information you have available for your applicants. So the same guidelines from the earlier slides on Section 2 apply for how you would identify and report households. So you'd need the income information and making sure it's annual and identifying and calculating each household's poverty level. But the difference is with applicant households, you will have some that did not complete the application process or for whom you did not collect income information. So that's why Section 5 includes that extra column to report households where you did not have income data available. They can go in column F. All right, now we're going to look at some final reminders. As we've hopefully emphasized throughout the webinar, in response to the issuance of LIHEAP CARES Act funds, the household report has been revised for FY20. It's also been revised for FY21. So if you're a grantee that has not, did not issue any CARES funds during FY20, the guidance in this webinar is going to be relevant for next year's FY2021 household report. The changes that were made are to add additional lines to the household report. Line 1 is where you report information in the same way you've reported it in the past. The first line for each assistance type is where you'll report the total households that received that assistance type or that applied for that assistance type. It doesn't matter if they received the benefit from CARES funds or regular LIHEAP funds. Any household that got federal LIHEAP dollars would be reported there. Line 2 is where you would report the households, the subset of households that received assistance with some amount of LIHEAP CARES funds. And then you'll see a third line, and again, that third line is not applicable for FY20, and it is locked from editing. That is there in case additional supplemental funds are issued during FY21. If you have any challenges with reporting or you're facing challenges with identifying CARES households that got CARES benefits, don't hesitate to reach out to us for assistance. The final household report is due in OLDC on December 31st, 2020. To submit that report, there's a few steps. The preliminary household report was due at the end of November. To enter that information, you would have initiated your form in OLDC, entered it, saved it, certified, and submitted. For the final household report, you would go in and access that report, unsubmit it, make any edits you need to, then resave, certify, and submit. If you have any questions about that, please reach out to Jorge or myself. The household report does include validation checks, and those are meant to provide assistance to you. If you want to go to the next slide, Jorge. The validation checks that you'll see, there's two types. There's warning messages and there's fatal error messages. A warning message just tells you that there's something in your data that you may want to look at to make sure it's correct. Some of you see the same warnings year after year because of something unique with how your program operates. But if you see any pop up, that's where you would want to include an explanation in your notes saying, saw this warning, here's why we received it and why our data is correct. If you receive a warning and you're not sure why you're receiving it, reach out to us. Fatal error is where there's some kind of a inconsistency that will prevent you from being able to submit your report until that error is addressed. So if you receive either of these and you need help resolving it, reach out to us. Once you submit the final report, we do look at them and run a series of checks to verify the data. We'll email you to alert you of any questions or any issues. And again, that's to make sure that your final information that is submitted and on the record is correct. Once you receive that email, if you could please respond to any questions we have. And then once your report is confirmed complete, your liaisons will accept it in OLDC, and that information will be used to populate the report to Congress and and the LIHEAP data warehouse.
So for some of you who may not be familiar or pretty new to OLDC, it's accessed through Grant Solutions. You can log in using the website here, and once you're logged in, you'll click OLDC in the top taskbar to get to the home page. If you need assistance, you can contact their help desk directly at the numbers provided here or the email address provided here. If you're having issues getting a hold of them or have questions that aren't getting resolved, you're welcome to reach out to us at Apprise or your liaison so we can help you with that. There are several resources available for you as you finish this report, including the poverty guidelines we mentioned earlier, the report, action transmittal, and instructions. The check before you submit document is a great resource that you can use either as a director or your IT staff can use if they're the ones putting together your report to make sure that the numbers all align. And then also, if you just need some context or a baseline, you can look at your past year's household report data on the data warehouse, and the website is listed here. Just some final reminders. The 2020 performance data form, which is normally due in January, OCS is expected to issue the instructions and action transmittal soon for this data form report. For Module 1, grantees will need to report the uses of LIHEAP CARES funds. For Module 2, which is the performance measures, there will be no changes to the reporting requirements. Your FY 2020 carryover and reallotment report, the final report is due on December 31st, 2020. We did have a webinar in October, and you can go watch that webinar here at the link to the YouTube training channel. I can't underscore enough how much help there is out there if you need it. Even with the little questions you think are tiny or silly, please reach out. There's so many people here ready to help you, your liaisons. There's a link here to find out if you don't know who your liaison is. Once again, the help desk at OLDC and several members of the Apprise team we're all ready and willing to help. And if we can't help you, we'll get you to the person who can. So please don't spend a lot of time banging your head against the wall. If you're having issues, just give us a call and we'll help you any way we can. Now I'll turn it over to Jorge.
Hi, everyone. Just a reminder, you can type in your questions into the question box, and then I'll get them and read them to the presenters. We do have some questions outstanding from the last Q&A session, so I'll just start by reading them. So the first question is, where do you state that this presentation would be posted?
So we go through a process of getting them captions put on them, and then they get posted on the LIHEAP on the ACF YouTube channel. So that's where you can get a recording. If you need the slides, you can download them now from your handouts, or you can email us and we can email you the slides.
Thanks. We have another question. In some instances, a household may receive assistance more than once in a fiscal year. If vulnerable household status or the federal poverty level of the household changes from one assist to another, how do we determine which bucket they fall in? We have been reporting this based on the first assist, but I want to confirm that this is appropriate.
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, you may, you assist households at different times during the federal fiscal year. Things change in households, as you know. There is guidance on this in the instructions, and in some cases, if they're receiving one type of assistance and then later they get another type of assistance, you would just want to report them using the information you had for each assistance type at that time. Then when you get to any type of assistance category, I think taking the first one is what the guidance says. So that's fine as long as you do a consistent approach to it like that. Jorge, do you have anything I'm missing on that point from your recollection?
No.
Yep. So if you have any more questions, reach out. That you are following the guidance that's in the instructions. We'll keep taking questions, but Jorge, can you put the poll up? We also, before anyone jumps off, we'd like you to answer this poll so we can make sure these are improved in the future. This is how confident are you that you understand how to correctly complete the FY 2020 household report at this point? Very confident, somewhat confident, not too confident, not at all confident. It's anonymous. We don't know who says what, and but it's helpful for us to see how we're doing and how we can improve. Any other questions, Jorge?
Yeah. So one of the questions is, I am seeing the old form in OLDC. How do I get the correct form you showed?
If you're seeing the old form, so line 1 is heating, then there's only one heating line, then you see cooling, then you see crisis, and you're not seeing the additional lines, that means that you may have initiated your form earlier, like over the summer, before the updates were fully made, and we can reach out. We've been emailing states instructions on how to correct that, so we can follow up with you and send you instructions on how to quickly correct that.
And we have one more question. Will the changes to the grantee survey be similar to this?
That's a good question. So as Melissa said, they're in the process of, OCS is in the process of having those changes finalized and approved. They will not exactly look like they do on this report, but you will, for example, you will likely need to report this is how much of our CARES dollars we obligated to heating assistance. This is how much we obligated to cooling assistance, for example. And so if you did obligate some of your funds during FY20, you'll need to report how you obligated those funds. Also, as she mentioned, there's no changes to the performance measures, so you'll not need to do any CARES reporting, distinct CARES reporting for that module of the report. Any other questions?
No, I don't see any questions, but if you have any additional questions, you can send us an email and we'll gladly respond to them.
Yep, and as once the performance data form is ready and the instructions and guidance are issued to you, we'll be scheduling webinars to train for those reports as well. On behalf of Melissa and Jorge and myself, we thank you for your time today and hope this training was helpful, and hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.